today I did want to. I chose to go over three things that really don't pertain necessarily to what we read, but it's things that have gone, that we've gone through several times that have come up in your readings, and I just want to kind of go over them. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you right now, they're weird. Okay, now the women treatment of women and all that's not weird, but the giants and the gods over the nations, we're going to talk about that. And like I said, I'm just going to tell you that it's going to be a little weird, but just follow, ask any questions that you may have, and we'll talk about each section as we get through at the end. Like first, we're going to talk about giants, and we'll kind of talk about the implications of the different things. Okay, so giants. You have several times you have giants mentioned, and so what exactly is that? And you have a couple of options as to the references to the giants. I mean, technically you have several options, and we're going to kind of intertwine them together as we go through. Regardless of how you look at it, it hinges on your understanding of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Okay, and we've talked about this before, but if you do want to look at that, Genesis 6, 1 through 4, we will read over that. As you look for that, though, I will say, I'm going to kind of give you the overview of both of those. So the first interpretation is that the sons of God in that passage are divine beings who have sexual relations with human women, and their offspring are the Nephilim, which it talks about, who are literal giants, okay? And that sounds crazy, of course. But that is the view of First Enoch, which was written 200 years, within 200 years of Jesus. It's quoted again in Jude, and it's alluded to in 2 Peter. It's the view of the Septuagint, which again is what is that? The Septuagint? The Greek translation of the Old Testament. Good, very good. All right, and again, that is the Bible of the New Testament authors. When they quote from the Old Testament, they're quoting from the Greek Septuagint, right? It's the view of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are the people, the Essenes, where we got the Dead Sea Scrolls, that group that lived there. It's the view of Josephus, who is the ancient historian who lived he wrote shortly after the time of Jesus, basically. Within that next 60 years. And note that sons of God never refers to humans in the Old Testament at any other point. So if this sons of God in this passage is referring to humans, then it would be the only place in the Old Testament that sons of God does not refer to angels, right? So again, it's weird, but it's the clear understanding of the Jewish people. The second is that the sons of God are simply heroic human rulers who somehow went afoul by either marrying common women, polygamy maybe, or exercising what's called the right of the first night. And what that would be is, so every time someone gets married, they would take the opportunity to sleep with that person's wife on their wedding night to basically assert authority over those people, right? So it's something, but we don't know exactly what that would be. If they're humans and it's talking about some sort of human deal, then we don't know exactly what the problem is. Like, what did they do wrong? We don't know for sure. So the offspring are heroes like we think of in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, right? And so Gilgamesh is technically a part divine, part human king of Babylon. Obviously, it's a mythological story, but he does all these shenanigans and things and goes through all the stuff. There's a story, you probably read it in senior English. But so it would be, those mighty men of old would be like Gilgamesh. In other words, that's what the ancient people would be thinking. Okay, so those are your two basic options, either divine beings or human mighty men. So let's read Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And I'm actually going to read all of this stuff about giants because the New Living Translation kind of really accentuates the whole giant still, whereas the ESV, which I normally use, does not. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read all this from the New Living Translation, which is what your chronological Bible is, and then I will supplement with the English Standard Version to kind of show you where it's different. All right, so Genesis 6:1 says, "Then the people began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw the beautiful women and took any they wanted as their wives." Again, note that sons of God means angels everywhere else in the Old Testament. "Then the Lord said, my spirit will not put up with humans for such a long time, for they are only mortal flesh. In the future, the normal lifespan will be no more than 120 years. In those days, and for some time after, giant Nephilites lived on the earth. For whenever the sons of God had intercourse with women, they gave birth to children who became the heroes and famous warriors of ancient times." Right? So the New Living Translation really kind of elaborates a lot on that. So for that last part, the ESV has this. It says the Nephilim. Notice it does not say the giant Nephilites. It just says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Right? So that's more literal. That's more like what the text says. Right? So you've got these Nephilim who were on the earth, and also afterward, when the sons of God, which again always means angels everywhere else, came into the daughters of man, which seems to be pretty straightforward, and they bore children to them. These children of the sons of God and the daughters of men, however we're going to look at it, are the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Again, regardless of how you look at it, it would be people like Gilgamesh, right? And again, Gilgamesh is probably completely a mythological character. It's possible he was a king, but he obviously didn't do all the things that the mythology say. It's like King Arthur, right? It is very unlikely that King Arthur actually lived, but it is possible that there was a king named Arthur or some sort of tribal leader or something named Arthur. But obviously he didn't pull a sword out of a stone and, magic and dragons and Merlin and all that stuff. Okay. Note that the King James has this. It's at 6:4. It says, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown." Right? So that actually consolidates everything a lot more. So the New Living Translation has giant Nephilites. The ESV has Nephilim. And then the King James just had giants, right? So there's kind of your whole gamut there of that whole word. And the problem is the word Nephilim. We don't know what the word Nephilim means, right? Sorry. Why does it get associated with giants? Because later in this passage that we're going to read coming up in Numbers, it associates them with giants. And so therefore those two things are put together. And so therefore the King James and the New Living Translation go ahead and put the word Nephilim with giants, or just put the word giants. Because the King James translator said, well, that word must mean giants. And the New Living translation translator said, I don't know. So we'll just put giant Nephilites just to cover all of our bases. And then the ESV translator said, I don't know what it means, so I'm just going to put Nephilim, which is the actual Hebrew word, right? So we call that transliterated, right? It's just written out in English letters the way it's pronounced in Hebrew, right? And so that's the word. Okay, so Numbers 13:25 through 33. Okay, Numbers 13:25 through 33. This is going to be the story where where Moses sends the people over to spy out the land of Canaan, and they come back with their reports, and most of them are scared. But of course, Caleb and Joshua, they come back with a good report and say, "Yeah, we've got this. Our God's got this. We can defeat them, right?" And so this is that whole story. At verse 25, after exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned to Moses, Aaron, and the whole community of Israel at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. They reported to them, to the whole community, what they had seen and showed them the fruit they had taken from the land. This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here's the kind of fruit it produces. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak, right? So now you got different giants, and they're descendants of Anak. And you're like, seriously? More giants? Note, too, interestingly, that the Nephilim that we talked about before that could be giants, they're before the flood, right? And so then everybody's destroyed, and now we're after the flood, and so therefore, if these are somehow related to those giants, then we have some more interpretive issues, right? So the ESV says this. It says, however, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. So it doesn't say that they're large there. It just says the descendants of Anak. Again, the problem is later on, Anak is also going to be associated with giants. And so therefore, the New Living Translator said, okay, we're going to make this simple. We're going to add the word giants next to Anak so that we know what's going on. So continue on to verse 29. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go out at once to take the land, he said. We can certainly conquer it. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. All right, so there's another reference to large people. So the ESV says this. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height, right? So again, you've got, they're trying to figure out how do we translate this stuff. Verse 33, we even saw giants there, right? The descendants of Anak. So there you have it again, those two associated together. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. Okay, so there you have a more specific, like, we're like grasshoppers. But then notice the ESV has, and there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. So there you have the Nephilim, you have the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and then you have, we're like grasshoppers. So all of those things together seem to indicate that both the Nephilim and the sons of Anak, the sons of Anak are all large people, right? Regardless of how you look at them, they're larger than normal. So what does all this mean? So what do we do? So one, you could say we are talking about actual divine human offspring, okay? So if that's the case, you have two options. So you have the Nephilim in Genesis 6. They're actual offspring of this divine being, fallen angel, however you want to look at it, human commingling. But then what about the flood and what happens after the flood? So then you would say either A, they somehow survived the flood, right? And there's different theories of that. Or you say that when they get to the land of Canaan in Numbers, they aren't literally giants, but they're saying that they're like the giants that lived before, right? So they're comparing them like hyperbole to the giants before. And they're saying they're so scary that they're like the Nephilim, and they're using that in comparative language, right, as hyperbole. The second, obviously, option is that we were talking about heroic humans, which would explain the reference after the flood, because again, you just have more heroic humans, even though it does say that their lineage goes back to Anak still. Either way, you have that lineage And there's different ways to deal with that, but ultimately, it doesn't matter. But again, the problem with it is not the understanding that was held by the Jewish people from that time period all the way up through Jesus and into like through the first century, right? They pretty much consistently understood this to be divine, human commingling. But again, let me say this. Just because they believed it doesn't mean it's true, right? So, I mean, that doesn't mean that they're all authoritative, the Jewish people. But again, note that this First Enoch, which that story about this is quoted directly in Jude 6 and 15, that whole section there at Jude 6 through 15. And then 2 Peter, maybe 6, I think, alludes to it. So, and even then, so what does that mean? Does that mean First Enoch needs to be in our Bibles because the New Testament quotes from it? No. It just means that that is a story that was popular during the time of Jesus and after that Jude and Peter used in order to make a point, right? So it doesn't mean that it's inspired or anything like that. They just use it to make a point. So either way you look at it, the references to the other giant clans, the Rephaim, the Zamzumim, the Emim, and the Anakim, which are these people, sons of Anak, that we're talking about, are all seen as descendants of these Nephilim, whatever that means. Whatever the Nephilim are, whether they're just mighty heroes of old, like in our minds, Gilgamesh, or for us, you might say like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, right? Or something like that. And it's just describing them as mighty heroes that we think of in old times. But again, you can't know for sure. I can't say to you, oh, it's definitely this or that or the other thing. And again, let me say this. You look at that first interpretation and you say, well, that's crazy that they would think that. But again, it is the most plain reading of the text, right? And there are other strange things in the Old Testament that we can't explain. It is our... And let me just say, I have a scientific mind. In other words, I'm very, analytical, but we do often, take away from the supernatural nature of the Bible, right? And we don't want to do that. If it's clear that that's what it means. Here, of course, it's not clear, but it does at least deserve some, consideration. I will say this, and I'm not going to go into it, and it actually relates to this and the next part. So one of my Hebrew professors, he actually just passed away with cancer, Mike Heiser. He has a book called The Unseen Realm, and then he wrote other books after that. We've talked about the divine council in here and all of that. And so he wrote a lot of stuff about that. And so he goes into this, and he does take the divine, the sons of God are divine beings, and the daughters of men, and he goes into all of this stuff that fits all the way through to the to the New Testament, and it's interesting. I don't always agree with him, but it does make you think. And every page that I get to, and he says, you read this passage and this says this and this is what it means, and then he'll go and explain it. Well, before he explains it, my instincts are always, that doesn't sound right. That sounds crazy. And then you read it and you're like, well, that's definitely what it seems to say. Like definitively, right? And so some of this is just stuff that we gloss over, and so we've never put any thought into it. And so we just assume, that everything's fairly normal, right? But it's the Bible, and there's a lot of things that aren't normal. We accept some of those because we've always heard of them, but then some of the other things that we've never thought about or that are more complicated, we just glaze past those and we think, oh, that's just normal stuff. Well, not always.
None of the genealogies of Shem, Hamm, and Japheth point toward giants, do they?
No.
I mean, they say this one went to Ethiopia, this one went here, this one here.
Yeah, but they only go to 3 places, right? So, I mean, yeah, and I don't want to get into, like a long conversation about it because it does, there are several debatable points, and one of those is, and I had to write a paper about it in Mike Heiser's class in Hebrew. but there is a way to interpret that section with the flood to where it is a local flood and not a worldwide flood, right? And I know that gets people, nervous and stuff. The Hebrew will allow for that, but again, it's not really. I mean, I don't know that it's necessary. I will say this: the Noah, the Noah movie, which I never actually watched, but it has giants and stuff in it. So just for the record, that's where those giants come from. It's from First Enoch, because it has giants in it, and it comes from this passage. And so you look at that and you think, and it is, I think it's foolish, but as far as that movie, I think the movie's foolish. And I think that explains too. I think if I'm not mistaken, don't the giants get on the ark as well or something? Don't they somehow survive? Okay. So, but that's kind of where those movie makers are getting that from. So they're kind of taking bits and pieces from different Jewish traditions and putting those all together. So again, I don't want to go into a lot of detail on all that, but there are certainly explanations as to how they could have gotten there. One of those explanations is even that Noah has Nephilim blood or something, and so therefore his offspring could eventually whatever, but the Bible doesn't say any of those things. You would have to extrapolate from it, and it doesn't say those things. It's fun to do, but ultimately when you look at it, you have to say, well, it doesn't say that. However, it does say that the sons of God had sexual relations with the daughters of men, and so it's just, we can't go as far as we would like to go with that. And so that's the thing, is it doesn't flesh it all out. Probably the most logical thing is sons of God, daughters of men as divine and human, but then the later Numbers passage maybe that is just hyperbole, saying they're like the giants of old, maybe. But it doesn't say that either. So it just says Nephilim. And we don't know what the word Nephilim means, so it's just confusing. That's the fun thing about biblical interpretation. It seems so easy when you read it in an English translation, but it's a lot more complicated. And that's why I try to use different passages from different translations, because you see how different it is. And it's not a conspiracy, right? It's the translator's true desire to help you to understand it as best you can without making too much about theology, right? Like putting their own theology into it.
Joe, I was in the Atlanta Falcons training camp one time.
Okay.
And I was waiting for them to finish practice. And when they came running in from practice, I felt like I was in the land of the giants.
Yeah. Right.
TV doesn't show how huge they are.
Right.
And these people going into a foreign land, people
Yes.
just might have been taller.
Yeah, they might have been, yeah.
And the Jewish people as a whole don't seem to be huge people.
Yes. Very, very possible, yes. Yes.
I did read though somewhere that one of those people back there, his bed was like 13 feet long. And
I think it's Goliath,
King.
right? Or is it?
The king.
Oh, it may be Gilgamesh. I think that might be Gilgamesh. Oh, and see, he's from that time, right? If I'm not mistaken, right? He's from that time, and so he would be from that time of those great men and all that. But yeah, if his bed is that big, but note that Goliath is super tall. The problem there is, if you look at, we talked about the Masoretic text, and we talked about Septuagint, and we talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so one of them says he was 9 feet 9 inches, but then the others say that he was 6 feet 9 inches. Which either way, he was a super tall guy. But even then, it's like, how tall was he? If he was 9'9", he's super huge, right? If he's 6'9", that's a big old guy. But even then, we could at least say, okay, well, we could fathom that kind of thing. All right, moving on. Okay, and we've talked about this in passing in the past, but there was a widespread belief in the ancient world that different nations had their own gods. So every nation had a god, right? And we've talked about how we go to battle in, speaking of David and Goliath, right? We go to battle with Gardendale from here in Morris, and we go and we fight. Well, it is not really us fighting against them. It's our God fighting against their God. That's the way the ancient people saw it, right? And so that's why I can send out David to fight Goliath, because it doesn't matter whether we send 5,000 people out to fight each other or whether we send 2 people out to fight each other, the gods are going to decide who's going to win either way. And so it's just a way of killing less people, right? Because the gods are going to decide. That's part of that whole deal. Note that the king of Assyria states in 2 Kings 18:33 through 35, he's talking about don't listen to your prophets because I'm going to come and take your land. And his point is, none of the gods of the other nations prevented me from taking their lands, so why do you think Yahweh would protect you? So he says, has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena and Eva? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their lands out of my hand? That Yahweh, says the Lord, but Yahweh should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand. So his point there is the gods of the nations, they weren't able to defeat me or my gods. And so therefore, Yahweh is not going to be able to protect you, right? And we can look at that and we can say, well, yeah, but that's an Assyrian king. Of course he's going to talk like that, right? Well, we have that same mindset, apparently, in the Old Testament itself. So Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9, for instance. It says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Right? But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. And so again, the understanding seems to be that in some way, however it worked, and it seems to be after the Tower of Babel, God divided up the nations among his divine council of divine beings. And again, to be very clear, there aren't other gods, but there are other divine beings created by Yahweh, right? We absolutely know that. I think everybody agrees there's divine beings created by Yahweh. And so here, it seems to be saying that he divided them up. Now, the thing is, you're going to have in some of your translations where it says, divided them up by the sons of Israel, okay? So then that would make more sense from a logic standpoint. You say, well, okay, well, it's clearly Israel. However, both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, which are both older than the Masoretic text that your previous translations were done from, like the King James and such. Really, it's just the King James that says sons of Israel. Whoa, that was weird. That's the only one that says sons of Israel. The others all say sons of God. And so it seems to be understood that Yahweh divided up these divine beings over the different nations, right? And you say, that sounds crazy. I don't believe that at all. So then you go to Daniel 10, and at 10:13, it says you have Daniel there, and you have a divine being who comes up to him, right? At Daniel 10:13. You have a divine being that comes up to him, and so this being is either God himself or the angel of the Lord that we've talked about, right? The angel of the Lord is either God himself, and so again, if he's in human form, you can think that he looks like Jesus, or he has to be Jesus, or however you want to look at that. Jesus is God, obviously, so regardless, it's God, right, in human form. Or it is a divine being who has the authority to speak on God's behalf in the first person. And so it says, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But Michael, one of the chief princes, right? So notice he says the prince of the kingdom of Persia. So you say, okay, well, the prince is the king of Persia, right? That's just the king of Persia. Withstood me 21 days. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia. Well, we know Michael, and the reference here is to Michael, the angel Michael, right? Who is apparently over Israel, or helps Israel, or however you look at it, and is referred to as a prince. So that angel, Michael, is referred to as a prince. So therefore, the prince of the kingdom of Persia, it would make sense, would also be a prince, right? Would also be a divine being or an angel. It says, one of the chief princes came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia. Now, the other interpretation, because some people have a problem here with, so why would God need help from Michael in fighting this other divine being, right? And so it could be that the angel is, that the divine being that talks to him first is Gabriel. Gabriel has shown up twice before in Daniel. The problem with that interpretation is that Gabriel has already shown up twice before, and he doesn't name him as Gabriel at this point. And so you say, well, why wouldn't he name him if he's already met him twice before? But again, so if you look at it and you say it's God, and you say, I don't know, it makes me uncomfortable that God would need help. Well, note that God fights with Jacob, right? And they struggle together. And it is part of God's plan, what he needs to do. He struggles with Jacob on purpose. Like, I mean, he could just go in and just kill Jacob, or he could kill Jacob from his, throne chariot. But he chooses not to. He goes in and he physically wrestles with him to make a point, right? And so, so God chooses not to just go in and kill him. So we don't know necessarily why God does things the way he does. So it's possible that if it is God, then for whatever reason, he's making a point or whatever it is. Maybe Daniel understood where we don't necessarily understand. So then you jump to Daniel 10:20, and it says, then he said, do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. And what he's talking about is he's talking about the different nations that will eventually come and take the land that Daniel's in, right? Like he's saying, like right now you're in Persia, whether he's in Babylon right now or Persia, but whatever, you've been taken by Babylon, then Persia, and then Greece is going to follow along right after, right? Well, I say right after, about 200 years later. And so it seems to be that he's referring to them by these princes or these divine beings, right? So again, exactly what that means, and you can always say this, guys. You can say, I don't know if I believe that actually is like a real thing. You could say that God is talking to the Israelites or Daniel in ways that he would understand because he might understand all this gods of nations stuff. However, the plain understanding of what it says is that these are divine beings that are fighting in the divine realm. When you get to Revelation 12, you get the first 6 or 7 verses. It has the dragon and the lady clothed in the sun with the moon and the sun and the stars and all of that stuff. You go back to Genesis 28. That woman is clearly Israel, right? And then her offspring is clearly the Messiah, Jesus, right? And so you go through all that stuff and all the symbols. It clearly says that the dragon is Satan and the devil. It even says, in case you don't understand, it says the Satan and devil, right? And so you have all that. But then you get to verse 7 or 8, wherever the transition is. I think it's at 7, where it has the same event where you have Satan trying to kill the Messiah, and then the Messiah is taken up to heaven. You have the same event spoken of again, but in heavenly terms, where you have Michael, the archangel, fighting in heaven against the angelic beings, right? The fallen angels and such. So you have a very similar deal, but you have a deal where you have things that are going on earth have a divine deal going on at the same time, right? And so it's what's happening here on earth is also happening in the divine world. They have a counterpart, right? And so it's not that foreign, okay? And again, the book of Revelation is clearly symbolic, but it's the same idea. So again, the point of me going through these is that they're confusing, right? It's not that I can tell you an answer and be like, okay, if you just turn to whatever page, it's going to explain all this, because it's not going to explain it. And you could read several different books and several by good Christian scholars and then some good not Christian scholars, and they're all going to tell you different things, or they're going to agree with each other in different places, and they're just not going to know. So it's not like I have a silver bullet for you, like I know all the answers where all these Bible scholars don't know. I just want to point out to you these things exist and what they could mean and kind of the ramifications, again, because my point is always to make you think the way an ancient Israelite would think. And let me just say, an ancient Israelite would have believed that there were different gods over the nations. So that's just the way they believe. Psalm 82. If you go to Psalm 82, you have this scene where God is admonishing these divine beings that are over the nations. And so you have another example of that. And it's interesting, if you read The Unseen Realm, this is the story that Mike Heiser says he was reading while he was in church that made him think about this stuff. And he read it and he thought, wait a minute, this is weird. Like, what does this mean? And this is what made him interested in all the stuff. But it says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. There you have that prince, right? Again. Arise, O God, judge the earth, and you shall inherit all the nations. So again, it seems, even though there are some interpreters who will say, this is talking about humans. This is talking about human kings, and he's mad at the human kings, and he refers to them as gods because they're mighty kings, right? But it says Elohim, and the word Elohim means God, right? And so, and it means gods. It's both plural and singular. We can refer to Yahweh, God, like as Elohim. That's God. But then he refers to these other beings as gods as well. But again, no matter how you interpret it, we are not saying, or no one is saying, that there are gods equal to Yahweh. They are all created beings under Yahweh that he puts to work doing his will, just like he puts humans to work doing his will, right? Throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, more the Old Testament, he puts humans to work doing the things that he needs done. We as Christians, God has put to work to spread the gospel, right? That is our job. God put us to that task, right? And so, whereas humans do God's will here on earth, he has divine beings that do his will in the divine realm. It's the same thing. Note that Paul recognizes that the pagan gods, he doesn't say that they're not real. He says that they're demons. Okay, so 1 Corinthians 10, 19 through 20, it says, what do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. Note that in the New Testament, demons are hostile divine beings, right? But generally the word demon means a divine being, right? Clearly in the New Testament, they're always hostile, right? But that's what these gods of the nations seem to be, is they seem to be hostile divine beings. They're hostile to God for whatever reason. They've fallen and they're hostile to God. So what can we say about this? However you look at it, whether you look at it as God just speaking to people in ways that they understand or whatever, I'm all about that. And there are definitely times when God speaks to people in the Old Testament and the New Testament, particularly in the Old Testament, in ways that they understood, right? Even though we look at it today and we say, well, clearly that's not the way the world works. But they understood the world differently, and there was no reason to try to do that. For me, this goes further than that, right? This is not just, like teaching them about how, the world works. This is about divine beings being over different nations and stuff. And so it's clearly what the people believed, but how far you take it and whether you believe that God actually put divine beings over the nations, that's obviously a different thing. And again, I don't have a silver bullet answer. It's dangerous to be dogmatic, though. And it's certainly, if just because we have an anti-supernatural bias, and I know generally we look at the Bible and we say, well, of course we believe in the supernatural because there's demon possession and different things but then we look at something like that and we say, no, I don't think that's what that's saying. Well, that's just because we don't think like ancient Israelites did. And so they would have believed that and understood that, likely to be that way. All right. Pretty good. All right, now we're going to talk about relatively normal stuff. We're going to talk about women in the Old Testament world, right? In general. And there's going to be some weird stuff here, so if you're here for the weird stuff, then you get that too, right? Note that in the ancient world, and so we're going to talk about generally first women in Mesopotamia. So basically women in the ancient Near Eastern world itself. Then we'll talk about women in Israel. And spoiler alert, there's not going to be a big difference, okay? There's not a huge difference between the two and the way women were viewed. Note that the woman was defined as either the wife of a husband or the daughter of a father, right? That's generally the way women are defined in the ancient world. Girls and boys would have been married shortly after puberty. It does help your heart to know that they did not marry younger than that generally. There's even one law that talks about, and not in the Bible, of course, it's in one of the ancient Near Eastern laws. It talks about, maybe it's a letter, but it says that it would not be appropriate to marry a child 3 years old, right? So it's like, well, at least they knew that, right? So that's a positive thing, okay? And I laugh about that, but just for the record, because I mean, obviously would be ridiculous, but they did do some vile things in the ancient world, and so some of those types of things you couldn't put past them in the ancient world. And just for the record, I mean, people do vile things today. I mean, obviously. So the father would arrange the marriage, and it would be a financial agreement and a contract generally. If the father was deceased, then the wife would be the one responsible, or maybe a brother of the bride. The bride was given a dowry by her family, which was hers if she needed it, right? So like if her husband divorced her, it would almost be, it's like a retirement. It's like saving up for your retirement. It's there when you need it, right? And so, or maybe an insurance policy. And so it's there if she needs it. If she doesn't need it, it would go into her inheritance to her children and such. The husband's family also gave money over to the bride's family, and that is to pay them for her service that they no longer have, right? So she worked in their house and all of that. And so basically the husband's family gives them money to compensate them for the loss of a worker in their household. If a wife could not get pregnant, right? Problems in pregnancy were always the woman's fault, right? Then it would be possible for the husband to take a servant in order to have offspring. A contract would be drawn up, making it clear that the first wife was still the head wife, right? So she still had the most of the rights. Note that they did not have all of the science and stuff that we have today. And so we know today that if a man and a woman can't have children, there's all kinds of things that could be wrong. It could be the woman, but it could be sperm count or any number of things, obviously, that could go wrong with the man that could make it to where he couldn't have children, right? The reason that it was always the woman's fault, and this is fascinating to me, is that in the ancient mind, the child, and listen, this is we're going to talk about adult things here, okay? So we're all adults, right? And I do this in my high school Bible lit class, so But the child was already developed in the sperm, right? And then that child is just injected into the woman, and then she is simply an incubator, right? And then the child just grows inside of her. So it's like your only job, woman, is to allow this child to grow inside your stomach. And so if you can't get that right, then and the way she would have looked at it is that God was mad at her, right? This would be why in the ancient world it was, if a man spills his, let's say it this way, if a man spills his seed any place other than inside of a woman, it was seen as abortive. Because again, they believed that the child was in the sperm. And so if you allow that semen to go on the ground, then you've aborted the child. The child has no chance to live at that point. And so just for the record, in the ancient world, no matter how you look at it, abortion was a big no-no, right? Like it was bad. And they saw abortion even as just simply that. Now, there were other ways of abortion. A woman could, kill her baby on purpose and and if a man accidentally killed a baby or whatever happened, there were many rules against those types of things. But even that itself was seen as abortive because of their mindsets and the way they believed. Divorce seems to have been rare in Mesopotamia just in general. A woman could divorce herself. A woman could divorce her husband in the early Babylonian period, which is about 800 BC to 1400 BC, which interestingly is about the time from the end of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus, right? So during that time period, that's the old Babylonian period, and that's the period when in Mesopotamia, a woman could divorce her husband if she was ill-treated. She would have to have witnesses to that. She couldn't just go and say. Adultery was a serious issue, which gave grounds for the husband to divorce the wife, but he also had to have witnesses. He couldn't just go and say, hey, she had, even though women had very little rights, hey, she had an affair, that would, you would have to have some witnesses. Note, and this is, adultery is only defined in terms of the woman having an affair, never in terms of the man having an affair. So a man can't commit adultery unless it is with another a woman who is married. In that case, it's adultery, right? But if a man goes to the cult prostitute down the street or just a regular prostitute, there's nothing wrong with that. They don't see that as bad. The reason it's bad for the woman is because it messes up paternity, right? And so if she suddenly starts growing she starts incubating a child, and she runs around, we don't know whose child this is, and they can't, do tests and stuff. So you might screw up the whole family situation if you do that. That's the reason. And so if the man goes off and does stuff, it doesn't matter to them as far as they're concerned. Again, it's the way they believe. I'm not saying obviously today that's messed up. We obviously don't think that way today, but it's the way they thought. So again, if you were a man and you had an affair with a married woman, at that point, then you are in trouble because again, now you're messing up another man's wife, and so at that point, you could die for that. Temples served as homeless shelters and allowed widows a place to work. So if a woman did not have a husband or she did not have a son, then she had nothing, right? There was no, or her father wouldn't take her back in. Those would be the three options of protection. And if you didn't have that, then you could go to the temple and you could work in the temple. Otherwise, you would either be a prostitute or you would sell yourself into slavery, right? Those would be your three options. Work in the temple, be a prostitute, or sell yourself into slavery, right? None of those are positive deals. In the home, women were responsible for taking care of children, cooking, cleaning, and making clothes. And that, that sounds like a lot. But let me just say, just the stuff that they went through to make food and such, it would have been a very, very hard life. Note that they also lived lots of people together in close proximity, which is part of that. So you have several women together who would be able to help one another, as they raise their children and stuff. They would do all this communally, right? In a community. Yeah. Rarely, however, women did own businesses and initiated land and slave deals in Mesopotamia, not in Israel. But in greater Mesopotamia, you did have some that did. You had women who could read and write in Mesopotamia. Again, not so much in Judaism. In the cult itself, so in Mesopotamian temples, you had women who participated in jobs ranging from the priestess all the way to the temple prostitute, right? And so you had various different jobs and ranges of jobs there. So women in Israel, again, you really assume generally that women in Israel are similar to Mesopotamian women, and really, I hate to say it, they seem to have less rights, okay? Note that first, the Bible, though inspired by God, is still written by men, right? In language that people understood in the day. The way I wrote it in my notes is note first that the Bible, though inspired, is written by humans in human language, and those humans were men, right? And so you do have a bias against women. In other words, women are only spoken of when they're important. So when you go through a genealogy, you don't have women in genealogies unless they're important for some reason. It's always men, right? But you have suddenly women. If you see a woman in a genealogy, or like when you get David's kids, right? You get Tamar, the only daughter. No, she's not the only daughter. I'm sure he had tons of daughters, but she's the only one mentioned. And she suddenly comes up and you're like, Tamar, why is she even mentioned? Because later on, not Absalom, that's her brother, Amnon is going to rape her. And so it introduces her early so that when she comes up later, and that's the reason that basically Absalom then, ends up killing him and then takes David's kingdom because he was mad that he didn't do anything about it. And so she's going to be important. So when you come across women in the Old Testament, they're going to be important for some reason, right? And so that's generally the way that works. Women were not allowed in Israel to inherit land except as placeholders until she marries a male relative, right? So she could inherit, but then she was expected to marry a male relative so that that land could then still be passed down through the male heirs in the family. This is also why you have what we call levirate marriage, where you have if the husband dies and she doesn't have kids, male kids, then the brother has to marry her, right? And he performs the duty for the brother, and so therefore those kids end up being the original brother's kids. They take his name, or however you look at it, they're his descendants, right? Well, they didn't name them like we do today, but again, barrenness. If you could not have children, it was seen as divine punishment. The woman's identity was completely tied to her ability to have children. She could be divorced if she could not have children. If her husband died and there was no kinsman redeemer, she would not inherit, and she would not have and she would not have sons to take care of her if she didn't marry a male relative. Again, adultery was generally punished by death, and rape is generally not assumed. You do have a couple of major instances of rape in the you have Dinah, right? And then you have Tamar, who is raped. The Tamar incident is horrible. There's actually some question as to whether Dinah entered into a consensual relationship and then which got that whole family killed, because it's not as specific, whereas the Tamar incident is just a horrifying incident. But it's not assumed. It's generally assumed and I hate to say it, we want to think of all this in terms of the United States in 2023, like their culture was just like ours. It could not be further from our culture. I hate to say it, but if you would go over to some of the more radical Islamic nations and such, their culture would be much more like what that culture would have been like back then. Because keep in mind, those radical areas, and I don't want to say, I guess radical is the word. Extremely conservative. I don't know how I don't want to call it conservative. Whatever. They basically say we don't want to change anything that's happened since 600 AD, right? And so because we want to live like we lived in 600 AD when Muhammad was around, we want to live life exactly like Muhammad lived it, right? And we want all the rules to apply just like they did in 600 AD with Muhammad. And so they've basically been frozen in time because of their belief system. And so therefore, they are much closer to this time period than we are as far as in mindset. That's why in the Old Testament, generally when a woman is raped, she is pressed to marry the person who raped her, because that would be the way, and it's a horrifying thing for us to think about, that's the way that she would be most protected. She could still have offspring. Those offspring would take care of her in her old age. She would be able to, produce children, which is her job. Once she's no longer a virgin, she is considered in the ancient world, she would be useless. And so if she doesn't marry him, then she will likely never get married. And so as horrifying as it is for us in 2023 United States, that's the way they would have looked at it, is her best bet would have been to marry the person who raped her, which again, not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's the culture they lived in, and that's the way it worked. And that's it. Boom. That's it. Women in the ancient world. And it's 7:29. 1 minute to spare. Do you have any questions or concerns about any of that? I mean, you probably have lots of questions and lots of concerns, but any that I can attempt to clear up for you right this minute.
Joe, Ken Hamm
Yes.
wrote a book 10, 12 years ago, I guess I read it, about our high school and college students.
Okay.
Almost Gone, I think was the name of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he interviewed all these churched
Mm-hmm. Sure.
kids
Yeah.
and said that most of them did not believe Jonah and the whale, Daniel in the lion's den,
Mm-hmm.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They took all that as kind of Bible fairy tales.
Okay.
They said that the larger majority of them did not believe. There was a lot of other things that were just really, kind of off the page.
Sure.
But, as a kid, and Cindy and I have discussed this several times, I just eat all of it up. I believed every bit of it. I never doubted any of it.
Yeah.
And part of that is, I guess, childlike faith.
Right.
We don't have to have scientific logic
Yes.
for everything that's in the Bible.
And that's true as far as, so I would give a caution there. So first of all, there are Bible scholars who will say that Jonah and the whale is not a literal portrayal of a person who got eaten by a whale. Okay. So what they'll say is that it is a parable about God's grace to other nations and all that, and it's told in a funny, humorous story so that the ancient Israelites would have, laughed at it and understood it and that. And there is reason to believe that. I'm not saying it's literal or not literal, and I can say this: it would not bother me one way or the other, right? Because that story has so many things, like there's many different words in there that mean fish, and so then he's eaten by a big fish and all of that, and so it does come across that way, right? In different places in Hebrew, the way it's written, it could be a parable, right? You go into things like the creation narrative, right? There are reasons that some scholars who are conservative Christian scholars will say that there's not 6 literal days and different things like that. There are arguments to be made. I'm not judging one way or the other those, but I'm just saying that there are arguments to be made. You get to Abraham, and it's not just willy-nilly, like, oh, well, I can just say whatever, I can say anything that I don't like is, whatever. It must not be literal. No, because it's written in different genres, and that's the problem, is you have to look at it in the genre that it's written and say, okay, well, this is written in a genre that could be a parable, whereas this is like Job, for instance, okay? Job is written all in poetry. It's not written in narrative format, right? And so it's possible that Job is and if you look at the literary style of it, it's certainly possible that Job is a really long parable, right? And there are reasons to believe that. And then again, some people don't agree, and that's fine. But there are reasons. But when you get to Abraham, for instance, like Abraham is written as narratives, right? So when you get into that material, well, that stuff is written as narrative. It's not so you can't just look at Abraham and say, well, Abraham, this part's not literal, blah, blah, blah. Jesus and stuff like that. You can't look at the story of Jesus dying on the cross. It's written all in narrative. So, and the way it's written, and the way the different gospels, it's clearly meant to be taken literally, right? So there are some things that it's not just willy-nilly or because science says this thing, so therefore I need to change my belief system. It could literally be taken different ways, right? So my caution is this: when we don't tell our kids about stuff like that, and this is his problem, when they go to college and they learn about science, and they see how logical it is, and they say, wait a minute, this makes a lot of sense, but I've never been told this. Or they've been told either science is real or God is real. You can't believe both. Well, once they see it for themselves and they say, well, this whatever thing in science is very logical and seems to be real, and I've always been told that either science is real or God is real, and they're mutually exclusive, okay, well, I'm going to believe what I see with my own eyes, and I'm going to believe this. And I think part of that is our desire to shelter our kids from things that we don't believe or that we don't want them to be, affected by early on. But what we've done is we've just completely shot them in the foot to where when they come across it in an actual college environment, they're completely taken aback by it. And they just don't know how to process it because this has never been taught to me. And this is so logical. It's the same thing about things in this class. When we talk about these different things and about the way the ancient Near Eastern people believed, y'all may not always agree with what I say, right? And I don't always agree with the things that I tell you as far as the different options. Obviously, I don't agree with every option, right? And I generally don't try to come down on one option or the other when we talk about these things, because I'm just going to tell you what the options are and what conservative scholars are saying about those things, right? You can make that decision for yourself. But if I take that decision away from you and I never tell you that, and then you hear some, wacko make some crazy argument about it, and it seems so logical or whatever, and you're like, wait a minute, maybe that is, whatever, that's a problem. And so I think that we have to make sure that our kids are informed about things that they're going to encounter, not saying like evolution, for instance. I'm not saying we have to agree with evolution. But kids need to know about it. I mean, they have to know. And they came here and they said, these science teachers in our schools, they have to teach that. It is the most prevalent scientific theory. It's not a science class's job to teach religion. Their job is to teach science. And it is the prevailing theory. Right or wrong, that's the theory. They have to learn about it. And so it's our jobs to say, okay, this is that. And then this is this, right? And so this is however you want to, put them together, or whatever you want to do. That's our job as parents, not to completely shelter them. Because once we shelter them and then they go and they learn about it in college or whatever, then they believe they've been lied to. And that's never a good thing, right? Because that's what kids do. When you never told me about this, right? Well, but I was just I didn't want you to lose your faith. Well, now I'm going to lose my faith because it sounds like you were just trying to keep it from me because it's right or it's better than God or whatever they come up with in their heads because we tried to do the right thing. It kind of irritated me because that guy was talking about science teachers. We have multiple science teachers in this church who are good science teachers and godly women, because there are women here. Well, Coach Higg, too. He was here. We have good science teachers who are godly people. And for somebody to come in here and say, you science teachers who teach, he doesn't know anything about that and about her or any of that. So, we have to be very careful because when we refuse to teach them about it at all, then we're setting them up for failure later on down the road. Because like I said, science is, it's logical. That's the whole point of science, is it's logical. And if you don't prepare your kids for what they're going to come into contact with, then they're going to be taken. And Ken Ham's problem is he wants to keep them away from it completely, and I think that's a problem. So, Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.